a global health consultant based in Washington, D.C., with over 25 years of experience developing, managing, and evaluating and providing strategic oversight and vision to reproductive health, maternal and child health, HIV, and health system strengthening and behavior change communication programs. She specializes in filling short-term senior management gaps, strategy design, and new business development. Previously, Michelle spent 15 years with PATH, primarily based in Kenya, South Africa, and before that was the Regional Adolescent Reproductive Health Advisor for USAID, REDSO. She began her career producing multimedia events for the private sector. And so now I will pass it on over to Michelle to get underway with the meeting.
Great, thanks so much. You just gave my whole presentation. Just wanted to take a quick moment and ask if everybody could put on their camera for a second, and I promise you can turn it off. Everybody can turn it off if they want, but I just want to get a raise of hands. I want to get a little sense of who we have out there. And just before then, I'll introduce myself more fully, but who out there is working on their MPH right now? Okay, about half. And who's in medical school? Who finished medical school? Who finished their MPH?
I'm about to start medical school.
About to start, okay, that counts. Who's been working in global health already? Okay, that's almost everybody. And who's worked in a lower middle income country before in global health? Oh, everybody's been overseas. Cool. All right, that helps a lot. All right, so now those that want to have their cameras off, do what you'd like. I don't care. So what I want to do today is talk for a little while and just kind of share with you my career trajectory and throw in a couple of stories, maybe a few war stories, but and then really leave it open for your questions. So, you know, maybe talk for 15, 20 minutes and then it's really your questions and I'll try to help out as best I can. As the moderator said, currently I'm a global health consultant. No job too big or too small, and my work can really vary, but I typically organize it into three different buckets. One is strategy development. So I might work with an NGO or a private sector company on a programmatic strategy, on a business strategy. Could be, you know, a whole range of things. I think this last 2 years, it's been kind of interesting. I've been hired, I've had 3 separate contracts where people worked in development, but in other sectors, and they were interested in breaking into the health sector because when they look and they see all the dollars there, and they wanted to say, hey, we usually do democracy and governance, or we do education. What are the skill sets that we have and how do we apply that to global health? Like, do we have something that we can market, you know, coming from within our existing core competencies? And it was just kind of interesting to me as a trend that 3 separate development organizations were all looking to break into health, while at the same time, a lot of the health NGOs are really kind of panicking and saying, we need to really rethink our business models. So it's kind of funny how the worlds don't collide. The second area where I do quite a bit of work is in program management. And I've come in as an interim program director. Sometimes somebody's off on maternity leave, so they just need some surge power for a couple of months to keep the ship sailing. Sometimes the donor has rejected the project director and they haven't been able to find somebody new. So I've done quite a few startups of new projects. Sometimes somebody leaves, and again, hiring always takes such a long time that there are various gaps. And right now I'm working full-time with an organization called Population Reference Bureau. And I'm going to kind of name drop organizations because these are all companies that, you know, each of you can think about, checking out their website and checking out opportunities that they might have as it seems like everybody's in different places in their career to look at. But anyway, I'm working, USAID has a global project called Momentum that's focusing on reproductive health and maternal and child health and nutrition. And they've organized it in a very different way. And I'm working on the component that's called the Knowledge Accelerator. So it's all about knowledge management, evaluation, continual learning and adaptation, and then strategic communication. So I'm heading up the strategic communication unit. I'm about 3 days old, so my head's kind of spinning. I'm still trying to figure out, how they're working and what's going on. And then the last area that I do quite a bit of work in is new business. Sometimes it's proposal writing. Sometimes it's reactive to a request for proposal from a foundation, from the government, from any government. And sometimes it's proactive, and it's just a topic or a subject matter that an organization or some individuals want to pursue when there really isn't a request that's out there. New business is not only proposal writing, but it's also, there's a phrase called capture planning, which is when you're anticipating a bid, what do you do to prepare? How do you get yourselves ready? How do you collect that intel? Often visiting a country, talking to government, what do they want? What do they need? What do you see as, as the needs? So it's a lot of intel gathering. And those are really fun trips because it's all about the dream, right? It's before you get to the design and before you get to the nitty gritty. So anyway, that's currently what my life's been like. That's been like the last 7-8 years or so. So what I'm going to do now is, kind of turn on the way back machine and kind of share with you how I got there and what happened. So I studied communication arts and English as an undergrad, wanted to be a great documentary filmmaker. At the time it was, Watergate had just ended and everybody wanted to be an investigative journalist. And, I jumped on that bandwagon. And I think it's much like we're seeing now post-COVID, like there's really a renaissance of interest in public health. So I came out with that degree and then it was like, oh, gee, what do an English degree doesn't really get you very far in terms of the job market. So I did the smart thing and I took off and went traveling and ended up living on a communal farm for a couple of years. Came back to the States and then probably got the most important job of my life. That first job when I came back to the States, I was waitressing. And I joke, but I want to say, I think that from a critical skill development process, that was like a foundational piece, that it taught me how to be polite to people whenever they're driving you crazy, how to do things in a timely, orderly way, to how to manage kind of craziness of 100 things coming at you from different directions. And I find 40 years later that I still think about that, and it helps just keep my cool in the fray of the pandemonium. So anyway, like I mentioned, I had this communication background, and one thing led to another, and suddenly I was developing corporate media, and which is like the last thing I ever thought I would be doing. Now the fun part was I got to use lots of toys, and we had giant budgets, and I was producing these ginormous corporate sales meetings for various computer companies and pharmaceuticals, and I had a really hard time. There was a lot of dissonance between what I was doing at work. I didn't really care if Gillette sold another razor blade, or Converse another sneaker, or digital another widget, or whatever that Lotus was still around. And I found myself describing to my friends that were more politically aligned with me and more interested in social justice, that my role was to rid the world of unnecessary hair, as Gillette was my biggest client. And I realized once I made that comment that I needed to make a change. So I was 30 years old at that point. I had 7-8 years of a really successful climbing a ladder career-wise, but this was at a time that HIV was, the epidemic was really hitting hard in the States. I was up at Boston at the time. I was working in media and advertising, and a lot of my colleagues were the first line of folks that were dying and were getting sick. It was a young age to be losing so many friends and colleagues, and I couldn't have articulated that now, but I think I kind of freaked out. So I quit and I went traveling. That seems to be my go-to when I don't know what to do. And anyway, when I came back after about 8 or 9 months, traveling in Southeast Asia this time, I decided, okay, I'm going to start my own business. I'm going to do media stuff, but I'm going to do it for nonprofits. I'm going to do it for issues and causes that I care about. And right away, I got a job to make a film for an NGO that was working in HIV prevention. And the idea was for people that were in recovery from substance abuse. And the mandate was make a film that you can show within the first 24 hours of somebody being clean and sober, that will kind of be a bit of a wake-up call of, oh my God, I probably led a risky life. Well, this is, I guess this is the late 80s by this point. And I spent about a year on it. And I really thought at that point, like, this could turn the pandemic around. Well, little did we know that 40 years later, we'd still be here. But that was kind of my transition. And then I started getting work from the Department of Health in Massachusetts, and they were outsourcing all their media and advocacy work to my little company, which was me, myself, and I on my kitchen table. And but I had a number of large CDC grants, lead poisoning, breast and cervical cancer, on and on. And work was really great. I was, I was interested. I did care what the outcomes were. And at some point, the commissioner for health for the state sat me down and said, great, all the media stuff, but it would really help if you had a little more public health background, if you had some statistics, if you had some epidemiology, if you had, just the basics. And since they were my primary client, if she said jump, I said how high. So off I went to Boston University and got a master's in public health. And somewhere in the middle of graduate school, I discovered that there was this whole field of global health. And this whole, and I had just had no idea that, I call it a racket, but that the whole world even existed. And got very excited and started taking demography courses. And then I ended up getting they had a certificate program that got you about a third of your degree that focused on delivering healthcare in developing countries. And there were about 3 Americans in that. Everybody else had come from a lower middle income country. And it was just a phenomenal, very intensive 8-week, 10 hours a day, kind of a course that I learned so much and made so many connections. Anyway, following that, then I was like, wow, I want to go overseas and I want to do this work. And I was all very excited, and who cares about the company? But how do you get that first job, right? That's the challenging part. How do you it's like getting an equity card. You can't be in a play unless you have an equity card. You can't get an equity card unless you've been in a play already. And that's kind of the obstacle that many people face, at the beginning of their careers. And now, I've worked and had a lot of junior staff come up, and it's very hard to make a decision, to make an investment, to send somebody, to Africa or to Asia or somewhere to do something they've never done, where they, it almost then takes 2 people for their first few times just to help them. And you want to mentor, you want to coach, but you usually don't have the resources. And then they get very frustrated. I've been working here for so long and I don't ever get to go, do the fun stuff. So I applied and got a population fellowship from the University of Michigan, which sadly no longer exists. But I can say there are a number of fellowships that CDC offers, and then also something called the Public Health Institute, PHI. And I know they keep changing, and for a while they were really focusing on historical Black colleges and universities. But that's a fantastic way to get your equity card, because it's usually a pretty high level screening process of who gets in, but and you get a job that usually is kind of scary because they kind of throw you in the deep end, but it's a phenomenal way to get experience. And I can help if people want, to get the links to that. So I first got hired through this fellowship program. And I have to say I was a unique candidate because I hadn't worked in reproductive health. I hadn't worked in any of these areas. And later I met somebody who said, oh, I remember you from the review committee and we didn't know what to do with you. That, I knew how to consult. So anyway, I got hired. So they sent me off to Kenya to be the regional adolescent reproductive health advisor. And I'm going to be very honest. I had been an adolescent, but that was about it. I had never worked with youth. I had never, done any programming in this. And my job, I was responsible across 22 countries, was to convince host country governments to invest more in youth, and then to work with the organizations, largely the international NGOs, to convince them to invest more in this area, and then to help them with their programming. So like I knew anything or like I had any experience. But one of the best things about this was I was working regionally. So if I went to Zambia, the first country, maybe I didn't know so much, but then I went to Tanzania and I was able to say, well, in Zambia, this is how they do it. And very quickly, because I was traveling like 80% time, it was a little insane, but it was really fun. I very quickly got to get knee deep and see what was going on and how different countries were reacting, and just to kind of apply that knowledge and to be continually, learning and adapting that information. So I did that for about 4 years. I ended up focusing quite extensively on post-abortion care, which, in most of these countries, abortion was illegal. Doesn't mean that people weren't inflicting abortions on themselves, and often in very dangerous ways. But usually all they needed to do, I'm sorry if I'm going to be too graphic, but is if they could draw a little bit of blood, then turn up at a clinic, the clinic was forced to address the medical issue, and then they would have a termination there. So we were working on policy issues, trying to make sure we had safe equipment, manual vacuum aspirators, making sure that they were doing postpartum or post-abortion family planning, and then doing policy and advocacy, really working to change the rules in the countries, and to make sure that midwives were trained in how to use this equipment and how to provide safe abortions, how to do counseling. That was a critical thing. We had studies that we did where women, where we would have a researcher sitting in the room where a termination was taking place. And basically the attitudes of the providers were, this is your fault, you did it to yourself. We don't care if you don't have anesthesia. We're just treating these women horribly. And we thought we wanted to document what was going on. And we thought, well, gosh, if we have a researcher sitting in the corner in that room, they're not going to act normally. They know that they'll be being watched. And, we were very worried about that at the beginning of the work. And it seemed to take less than 5 minutes for that provider to completely forget that there was a researcher sitting in the corner. And I could share horror stories, beyond belief. Anyway, after 4 years of working on a variety of adolescent issues, I moved over to an NGO, and I joined PATH, which used to be called the Program for Appropriate Technology in Health. And at that time, they were a very, very small organization that people hadn't really heard of, but they had a really interesting model. They were interested in developing new technologies. They were raising donor funds, building that technology. I'll give you a couple examples in a second. And then licensing it to big pharma or to a manufacturer. But with that license, they were basically tying their arms behind their back and saying, you have to produce X number of these widgets at X price, making them available or practically free in developing countries where the needs, were the greatest. So they never, the companies didn't have to invest in the R&D and all the legal and regulatory issues of bringing a new product online. And this was like a revolutionary model in the 70s and the early 80s. Now, a lot of tech is developed this way, but this was unheard of. And some of the early successes, one was something called a vaccine vial monitor. That one of the hardest things, and we heard a lot about this during COVID, is how do you maintain cold chain, right? So you don't know if somewhere along the line it got exposed. So we developed a heat sensitive sticker that if it got exposed to heat, it would turn red. Now, many of you are familiar with a similar technology that you see on your Domino's pizzas. Like, if it takes a delivery guy too long to get you your pizza, there's a sticker on it that'll change colors. Well, the problem with that, sticker on Domino's pizza, which was a simple technology. It works kind of like a mood ring. It can go hot, it can go cold, it can go hot and cold. So you really don't know what the history was. Your pizza may have gone back and forth a few times. Well, you can't have that with vaccines. So the trick was getting something that would, a color that would change, but then it would stay that color and not go back if later on the temperatures went back. And that was really a revolution. And now you see that on all vaccines that have, that require cold chain. It's just a normative thing. The second thing that Path invented early on was a syringe. I think you've all probably seen the films and the old pictures of 100 kids lined up under the tree getting, on immunization day, getting jab, jab, jab. And they were just reusing the same syringe over and over and over. And this, predates HIV and, was obviously a huge problem for all kinds of communicable diseases. So Path invented the very first auto-disable syringe. So you draw your vaccine or your medicine into the syringe, you inject, and then when you can't pull it out again, it's stuck. So it solved one very big public health problem, is we no longer had, reusing syringes, but then we caused another problem of like medical waste. So then that led to a whole nother set of technologies addressing, Path was very much involved in the first, the red boxes that you now see to put your sharps in. And one thing just leads to another, to another, to another, that you keep having to solve. So my role, I was out in the field, was to be kind of eyes and ears on what the needs were. And then as the technology was being developed, when it needed to be tested, whether we needed to, do early studies to understand what would be acceptable, whether we needed to do later studies to just actually put it in motion, and how did it work? Did people like it? Or, even later when it's efficacy studies and, ultimately through proper clinical trials, in a field program, we helped be the liaison to make that work happen in country. Other areas that I was involved in, I was 11 years in Kenya. We did a lot of behavior change communication work, particularly around HIV prevention. And it was pretty fascinating because at the time we didn't know what worked. And we didn't, and we were very lucky. We had a donor that kind of gave us free rein and said, figure it out, laboratory. We got to just, fail fast, but keep trying different things. And I want to just share just kind of an example of a comprehensive behavior change communication campaign that we did. It was a generalized epidemic at this point in Kenya. And we developed a communication strategy to start. And we said, our hypothesis was that we needed to get people to ask questions, that there was a lot of stigma. Nobody wanted to talk. People had very little information at that point. That's something that has, changed a lot over the years. But that if all of our activities, whatever we were doing, that the purpose was to generate questions. And the hypothesis being that if you ask the question, you want the answer. That we wanted to flip the paradigm. It wasn't us kind of coming top down saying, this is what we think you need to know. We wanted to stimulate you so that we really heard, what your concerns were. And I'm hoping that that would have a greater impact. And ultimately it did. But I'll share with you some of the components. We started off initially with some theater, doing community-based participatory theater. We started off just kind of the way everybody always did it. We hired a bunch of theater groups. Often the schools have all kinds of programs and communities. This is, a folk media that's very typical, people were very comfortable with. We hired 20 or 30 different theater troupes. We gave them a week's worth of training on this is what HIV is, and this is, these are the key messages. Your job is to do 10 performances a month and tell us how many people you reached. And, very quickly we realized that was not working. That wasn't, nobody was changing their behavior after that. And even more importantly, and even more sad, was we were getting ripped off. These kids weren't going out there and even doing the work. They were making up, it was all very corrupt. They were just making up numbers and mailing them back to us. So we slowly, we kind of deconstructed it with them and said, why isn't this working? And just kept saying why to every one of their defensive, arguments. And eventually we turned it upside down and we built what we called magnet theater. Instead of our theater troops going and running around the province to do these performances, we said, let's be static. Let's make it so that every Wednesday under X tree right next to the market, this theater company will be there, and then it would pull people. That's where we got to the magnet theater. And that turned out to be hugely successful. And I could spend another hour talking about that, but I think you've got the idea. We then started a weekly radio program called Kati Yetu, which means between us in Swahili. And the idea, we also had, doing this a little bit out of order, peer facilitation groups, there were youth meeting, there were men in the workplace meeting, women in the market, which were largely sex workers. We had kind of all of these, we segmented the market. And what we did is we documented the questions that they were asking in the discussion groups and then fed that in to give us the storyline for the radio program. So we started off calling it, we just needed feedback. They had to fax the questions that came up in the discussion groups. And then we always needed the information quickly, and it became speedback locally. We then so there was a direct connection between the discussion groups, and sometimes we would go back to the discussion groups and say, resolve a dilemma. Should he marry her? Should he take her to, tell her that he's HIV positive? And then you could have that discussion of, how do I tell her? We also used the characters from the radio program as the characters in the theater. And then we also took a little bit of liberty and created a comic book series for young people, taking the radio characters, making them a bit younger. It was kind of like Archie and Jughead. But we addressed a lot of issues. And I just wanted to share a story. I told this story the other day to a complete stranger in a very weird setting. But it struck home about how we do the work. One of the most important things in doing all this work is being culturally sensitive, right? No matter what, and I think from just quickly seeing everybody's face, most of us are not from the countries, where we're working. There's no way that you're going to have that inherent knowledge. So you really rely on your staff to be your ministers of a culture and to guide you. But sometimes your own staff can be the worst watchdogs, and they can, and they're not always representative of the community, because often, at least the staff that I had been to college, were living a fairly middle-class life in a capital, city, and they were, they'd go home and visit grandma in the village, but that wasn't really their day-to-day life. So we made this comic book that started off with the scene of, there was a football match and there were a couple of young women sitting in the stands, and they're talking to each other and talking about their boyfriends and, kind of having girl talk. And on the first page, one young woman asks the other and says, did it hurt the first time? And, the young woman responds with the truth. And they have a conversation that many of us all had at some point in our lives, or certainly were worried about. Well, my team was very much saying, no, you can't talk about that. You can't, they're going to throw this away. The schools aren't going to let it in. And I was just like, no, I think this is what we have to do, is get to those real questions. These are the questions that we're hearing from these discussion groups, that are emerging. And I said, let's just push it. If we get pushback, then we'll, change it, but let's try. We have to just keep kind of moving, pushing the envelope a little bit. We had nobody censored us. Nobody, even raised an eyebrow. We didn't get any feedback, any negative feedback about that. And so I guess I'm not saying don't listen to your staff and don't listen to the local norms, but also don't be afraid to push, and other people will have creative ideas. One other example from a reproductive health program that was a rights-based focus. We also had all these discussion groups going, and they were all same sex, same age group. And I was just like, that's not how the world works, right? You have to mix up that sociogram, that, it's parent, teacher, parent, child, teacher, student, boyfriend, girlfriend, every, combination of relationships that you could think about. So we had the idea of what about peer families? And again, we got a lot of resistance. Oh, no way, you can't have cross-generational anything. Nobody will talk. And we kind of pushed and pushed and said, let's just try it. We'll use our own money. We'll run a workshop for a weekend and let's see what happens. And we went down to Mombasa. We're in a very conservative area. We had quite a few Muslims that were there that were in complete, burqas and whatnot. And very quickly got into a conversation about rights. And a husband and wife got into a discussion. I'm using their language. I have a right to get it whenever I want. And she was saying, I have a right to say no. And this couple was having this argument. And after like 5 minutes of this back and forth and, each side defending their purpose, the little kid, I mean, he wasn't so little, an adolescent, raises his hand and he says, I have a right to know what's it, because he had no idea what they were talking about. And it was, at that point I was like, okay, this is going to work. And it turned out to be a brilliant set of interventions that was later evaluated and had a terrific impact. Anyway, that, that combination of all these activities I would kind of hold for me was kind of my signature work. We had the theater engaging out of school youth. We had the radio program. We had these discussion groups. We had the comic book series, and they were all connected with the strategy of question your relation. Oh, we did mural painting. We did that a little bit differently. Instead of just some mural artist painting something or that had some message on it, we would have a community event, raise some question as the title. It might have been a question of, should I tell my girlfriend I'm HIV positive, or that I want to go get tested, or it could be anything. And then people in the audience would shout out, well, here's how I would do it. And the artist would start to draft it, and then somebody would say, no, that's not the right way, and come up with another. By the end of the session, you had maybe 6 or 8 panels, almost looking like a comic strip, of different ways that you might tell her, until the community kind of came to consensus of, in this scenario, this would be what they thought was the best way. But they got to explore a number of different ideas, because no two people are alike, and no two situations are really alike. So just to wrap up, I later went to South Africa and did very similar work, very different environment than Kenya. I'll leave that for later. And then eventually I came back to the States and ended up leading Path's new business team. I made the mistake of writing a couple of successful proposals. I'll never do that again, because then you get pigeonholed into something, and it's a necessary evil, but I didn't want to be doing that full time. And so I spent a couple of years doing that. And then in 2013, I went out and started consulting. So that's my story. I went on a little longer than I hoped. I like talking about me. No, this was kind of fun just to refresh my memory. But I wanted to end just with a couple of things that I feel like I'm seeing in public health, kind of some trends that I think are really going to impact what the workforce looks like, for the next generation. And some of it I think is not impossible, but will be, it's going to present some challenges that are very different than the nearly 30 years ago when I entered the global health world. And some of them are very positive things, for development in general. But, if there was a silver lining from COVID, is that we really advanced local ownership by not being able to travel for these last 2 years. But for we weren't shutting down hospitals, we weren't shutting down services, we weren't stopping programs. I mean, they were impacted. And in some places, residual effects of supply chain and all of that had a huge impact. But what we saw is local leadership really grew and stepped up to the plate in a way that, and I'm sure you guys are all talking about this in grad school, that, we still have kind of a neo-colonial approach to development. And I think we made, terrific headway in tearing some of that down and enabling folks to do jobs that they're fully capable of doing. And now kind of the next step that's forcing the international NGOs to really rethink their business model. And we're seeing more and more donors putting requirements. Your project director needs to be from the country where you're working. It used to be your project director has to be American now, or if you were with DFID, it had to be from the UK or, whatever respective government. That's really, so what we're seeing is, and then they're also saying that they want a local NGO. We're seeing the big NGOs out there are what I call leading from behind. They're taking sub roles, and which is great. And from a mentoring, if they could really just mentor and coach and provide technical expertise that's needed, and there's big question marks there, that's fine. But that business model isn't going to allow those organizations to exist in the way they are. And truthfully, we're finally starting to work ourselves out of a job, which should be everybody's ultimate goal. Now, how we get there and how that transition happens, I think is going to be what we're all going to be facing in the next decade. And it's an important thing to think about. And we can discuss this more after. I think we're going to be seeing more and more a more distributed healthcare system. I think we're going to see the role of the community health worker really elevate. I think we're going to, we'll see it finally get professionalized. We'll have roles and responsibilities clearly defined. There'll be, paid a salary, respected, because they're the linchpin. We're seeing, the role that tech is playing is increasing at, rapid speeds. Whether it's, the sort of, I think self-care, we're starting to see more of that here in the States, but I think that's going to just grow in leaps and bounds in low and middle income countries even faster than it is here. I think we're going to see a huge focus continued on health system strengthening, on the role of equity. And, there's a lot of confusion around what equity means. And you want it to be, there's a quote I wanted to quote and I just left my head. I'll come back to it. But you want an equity of outcome, not an equity of output. That makes sense? And a lot of people don't understand that. They think, well, every single district should have exactly the same. Well, if in District X you don't have that disease, they shouldn't get that money. But it's very hard politically to make that argument. It sounds very simplistic now. I think trends that we're seeing, and I think, those of you that are studying, looking at digital media, looking at analytics, at data visualization, those are key areas that, 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have found a course in graduate school or undergrad even about that. Those are just as important to your core learning as your epi and your stats and all of that. I also will stand on a bandwagon, and it's mostly of a hair shirt for myself, is take those epi classes. That foundation, those fundamentals are so critical, whether it's teaching you how to read a study and know if it's really legit and what the outcomes really are, or whether it's trying to design work and, and measure your impact. It's just so critical to everything we do. And then the last trend is, I think we're really seeing a shift in funding mechanisms. We're seeing more emphasis on public-private partnerships. We're seeing those change, even in what they mean. In the early days, it was like, oh, great, Coke gave us some footballs. Now we can give some footballs to the kids, and then we'll talk to them about reproductive health, or life skills or whatever during the break between soccer matches. But now it's huge, real variety of different kinds of investing, setting up private healthcare systems, but working in collaboration with NGOs and with our host country governments. We're seeing more emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, more emphasis on innovative financing schemes. And, if that's an area of interest, then, the whole health economics piece, there's just a lot of creative opportunities there. So I think, the world is shifting. The disease burdens are shifting. I guess you all know a lot about that already. So why don't I just pause here and just take our last 25 minutes or so, whatever we have left, and I'll take any questions that you have. But somehow the dreamer that wanted to make documentary films and be an investigative reporter is evaluating public health programs now. So, thanks for listening and being patient. You're welcome. So any questions?
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. That was so amazing to hear about your experiences and also like your career change. I think there's definitely, I feel this pressure sometimes that like, when you go into your first job, it's like what you're going to be doing for the rest of your career. But it was great to hear kind of like how you made that switch. I guess off the top of my head, this is kind of more of a fun question, but do you have any favorite travel stories? Because it just seems like you've been all over the world and all over the place.
Oh God, ones I can tell out loud. Yeah. Well, I don't know, for some reason this just popped in my head. I have a favorite interview story, since all of you will be looking for jobs. So if we go way back, I had my own company. I was doing media, working largely for the Department of Health in Massachusetts. I had applied for this Michigan fellowship. In the back of my mind, I knew it was a long shot because I didn't really meet the criteria for, what you had to bring to it. So I said, okay, if I get it, this will be cool. If I don't get it, then it's time. I was 35. It was time to be a grown up and say, get office space. You have a viable company here. I was successful, take it to the next level. So I'm waiting to hear. So finally I get the letter, and I have such a vivid memory. I open up the letter and it's congratulations, you've been accepted. So you're like, yay, and feeling really good. Then you get to the next paragraph. However, comma, you are not a typical candidate, and it's very unlikely that we'll be able to place you very quickly, because basically you got accepted into the fellowship and then a country had to select you. And so anyway, and then it was a whole thing managing my expectations that it could take over a year to get placed and yada yada. So from my joy went to extreme disappointment. I just put the letter in a file in my cabinet and turned around, and I remember literally opening up the newspaper looking for commercial office space. I was like, this will never happen. And I was really disappointed. Well, about 3 days later I get a phone call, and the guy said, anyway, it's the guy that's the head of the office in Nairobi, and saying, got your CV, we'd be interested in you, can we, I guess we had a short talk at that point, very preliminary interview, and didn't ask much. And he said, I'm going to be in the States in like 2 months or something. I want to fly you down to where I'll be and, meet you. And, I think that's fine. That's a logical process. So I'm living in Boston. I'm kind of still working in private sector world. And I fly down to somewhere in Eastern Tennessee. I can't even remember the name of the town, but I had never heard of it. No disrespect to Tennessee. He tells me, no, this is even before, this is the fun part. He says, call me on such and such date and let's just confirm. So, I follow the rules. I call him on the designated time. This elderly woman answers the phone in this very deep Southern drawl. And, I'm, hello, may I please speak with Dr. Kirkland? And she just starts off, well, he's here from Africa now. I know I won't do a bad Southern accent, but he's here from Africa, and all they do is shop, shop, shop. And I've never met this woman. All I know is that when the back room is filled with all their boxes, it's time for them to go, back to Kenya. Right now, Ray took Katie and the boys to the mall, but he had a headache, so he came home and he's on the couch having a nap now. I mean, she, for a half hour, she's telling me, I'm like getting to the point, is my question going to be, is his belt buckle open or, closed? Anyway, way too much information. So leave a message. He emails me back. We communicate. He then says, just call me once you arrive in Tennessee. And I was getting there late at night. I'd come from corporate work. It's August. It's hot. I'm in like a suit, business suit. And I have another one like for the next day. That's the only clothes I have. because, it's a job interview, right? You put on your best. And he said, meet me in the front of the lot with a hotel at 8:30. Well, he zooms up in this little rental car with his wife and his three perfectly child-spaced kids at age 5, 10, and 15. They're all in beachwear. And he says, we're going to a state park. I had a suit on. And off we go to this state park. Oh, I know. And in the first minutes of in the car, where it's still kind of awkward and everybody's just being exceptionally polite, all of a sudden you hear his wife in the backseat curse, I forgot a corkscrew. So I'm just trying to make conversation. I said, well, I know how to open a bottle. If you bang it on a tree, the cork will slowly work itself out. It's very useful for Africa. She's all embarrassed and starts making us stop to find a corkscrew. I'm going to get to the punchline eventually. Anyway, we're stopping in these convenience stores in Eastern Tennessee. Nobody has, they have shrimp devaners, but they don't have corkscrews because it's dry there. Anyway, finally we get one. We get to the state park. Kids go down to the lake. I am like, it is just hot as can be. And I don't know, I think this will take me back to my student days. I think my shirt that was under my suit jacket, like I had cut the sleeves off or something, like I couldn't take my jacket off. There was something wrong with my shirt. And anyway, and so the first thing, it's like now 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, they open a bottle of wine. And I'm going, no, job interview, no drinking. I'll have juice, please. Anyway, by the second or third, I can't believe I'm going to tell the story. Anyway, very quickly, they're on to their second and third bottles of wine. And so eventually I join them. It comes time for lunch. We call the kids up and they say, hey, there's this weird guy hanging out in the bathhouse at the state park. And so we get a little nervous and don't let the little guy go on his own. But we kind of disregarded it. In hindsight, we were quite foolish and probably had a bit too many beverages. When they come back, so meanwhile, and we're talking and we're having a lovely picnic. No interview questions, nothing about anything, just getting to know each other. Finally, we're getting ready to leave. The kids go back to the bathhouse to change. And they say, wow, there's all these strips of toilet paper that some guy had been there documenting his exploits, very pornographic, very graphic. So the 15-year-old, of course, comes back with these long strips. And I'm leaning in and going, I can't, I'm on a job interview. I can't read this. I have to read this, not knowing at all how to handle myself. Anyway, it was the craziest job interview. Finally, he takes me to the airport and I'm like, are we going to talk about the job? Do you have any questions? Anyway, it was the most bizarre interview I ever had, but turned into being a good friend and a great job. I don't know. There's lots of crazy stories, but I'm running dry right now. I'm thinking of one in country, but that was my setup to get ready to move to Africa for the first time. I had never been there before. Anybody else? Sorry, got into shaggy dog mode.
Hi, Michelle. My name is Megan. I work in the Center for Global Health here in the med school, and I'm engaged with training activities for medical students, MPH students, as well as graduate medical education. And something we are always talking about in global health are the core competencies that are important. What would you say from your experience are the competencies that you feel have helped you in your success?
Sure. One, I mentioned already, was waitressing or being a server. And I don't say that lightly. Two, I think, being able to listen, not having to be the know-it-all that has all the information and thinks they're the only person that's right, despite those couple of stories I said earlier. I think that my background coming from some of the media and communication and kind of creative approaches and able to kind of blue sky really helped me in terms of design and kind of trying to think out of the box and not just accept, paradigms for the way they, approaches, the way they always were. I'm somebody that I challenge things. I question. I want to know why. And it helps to unpack things. I mean, definitely, I would say I regretted not paying more attention in statistics and epi. That, I always felt like, I ended up being a generalist and not really a technical expert. And sometimes, I wished I'd had a stronger background in that. I remember very vividly my stats professor he kind of reminded me of Mr. Rogers. Can you say Gaussian curve? I thought you could. All right. So that's what I think. I think also what really helped me was that I had worked in private sector and I had been a consultant, and I basically, my first job overseas was being a consultant. And even though I didn't know the subject matter so well, I knew how to be a quick study, and I knew how to hone in on what was, what I needed to know to do that task.
Okay.
Do you feel like those are covered in your programs now? Do you get that?
Yeah, so, well, there's a lot of talk about core competencies, and they're pretty standardized by now, but there are many. And a lot of them are soft skill based. And so there's, a lot of talk about the importance of soft skill almost, equally. Some people may say more so than hard skills. So, but yeah, you kind of covered a bunch of that. And thank you so much for making the time for this talk. It was great.
Well, thank you. I get tired thinking about all that time. Those years, a lot of years. But I think when I was at BU, I think I mentioned I did this certificate program on delivering healthcare in developing countries, and they were very smart. And this was at a time when this wasn't so popular. It's much more popular now with all the DEI stuff. And but they took us on a retreat for the first couple of days, and we did a lot of cultural sensitivity kind of exercises. And it was, a lot of those exercises, that was like 1991 or 90, and have stuck with me, through the years. I remember, hearing a comment of that, I think it was a Tanzanian woman made the comment of, why are Americans so, everything has to be on time. I invite you for dinner and I say, come at 6 o'clock. And to me, I'm offended by that, because you make me feel like I'm not welcome if I were to come at 5:45. And I kind of laughed because I wanted to think that, oh no, I'm not like that. But then if I've invited you for dinner, there's a good chance at 5:45, I'm in the shower, or I'm still vacuuming, or I'm panicking to clean up the kitchen before you get there. So there's an element of truth to that. But it made me change the way I set up before I have company, so that anybody can come to my house early. It's okay. But the truth is that everybody always comes like 2 hours late. That's the harder part, living overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Hi, Michelle. I'm Glenn Galton, Director of the Center for Global Health here at Penn. And so again, I want to echo Megan's comments and thank you for spending time with everyone today. I had a question that you pretty much answered in your response to Megan, and it was about the different skill sets, but I want to flip it around a little, because the moment you start talking about Watergate, you're going to date yourself, first of all, right? So that's unavoidable. But and those of us with gray hair, we're giving ourselves away anyway. But you came through global health, I'll call it that, public health, global health, at a time when the field was developing. And the candidates that we're training now, the young people that we're training now, are coming through at a time when the field is, reasonably well defined, at least, maybe not perfectly, but reasonably. And so, it bears a little bit on the comment, you just made a few minutes ago, when you asked about, and Megan responded to the sort of this soft skill thing. Folks that come through the training now aren't getting the kind of, they don't come largely from the background that you or even I came into global health, which meaning a totally different background. And so we brought a different skill set, had to learn the global health part, but we brought very different skill sets to the table. So given that the majority of candidates now that are percolating, through our educational programs and are coming into this field are coming through, programs now, how do they get and develop those other skills if it's not happening in the educational environment? And I guess kind of what I want to get to is your thoughts on the comfort level that you had changing domains, and your advice to the students on being flexible about having this kind of job at this point and this kind of job at that point, and not to be nervous about, if you're good, it works out, I think is what you and I probably would both say. But maybe you could walk them through a little bit how to create that depth and wealth of experience when you didn't have to do it because we didn't know better, for lack of a better way of saying.
Right. Well, if I reflect, a lot of it was naivete and probably a little arrogance and probably curiosity. I mean, I think that's what, just kept pushing me into different things. And I mean, for me, when I found global health, it was like, it just pulled all my worlds together. I got to travel, I got to do good, I got to, learn about different culture, it brought all these worlds together for me. In terms of getting those skills, I think some of it is maybe, I mean, I don't know, a lot of your students, are they looking to work domestically or they're looking to work globally? But, doing it in environments where they're, where they do understand the culture and getting comfortable there. It's just, getting as much practicum kind of experience, I think is critical. I mean, I guess in essence, you're asking how to get the soft skills, right?
Well, I don't, sort of.
I'm not sure how to answer.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I articulated the question very well. Let me try again quickly. What are your thoughts to the students on the comfort level with realizing that a good path is to actually have many different kinds of jobs at several different places? And there's a benefit to that, and they shouldn't be afraid of doing it. Let me just be direct about it.
Right. Well, I feel like I was just advising, I have a couple of nephews that are in their early 30s and they've all been at jobs for a while. And I was saying, twofold, change it up. Even if you're staying in the same career, it's the only way you're going to get your salary bumped up. Those kind of things. So I think just encouraging the change. I mean, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area where you have so many federal government employees that, that just stick because they got to get those 20 years in. But I don't know, I feel like young people don't have that mindset. And, to make a stereotype of just, if anything, I find the young people I'm working about, just have absolutely no patience for what you need to do at the beginning of a job, as kind of going through those baby steps of learning it. And, they think they should be in charge and running things, with no experience. I find that being, a bigger obstacle for me right now, kind of the opposite of what you're saying. We came of age Xeroxing, and then maybe we got to sit in on a meeting, and now they're like, anyway, it's very different.
Well, so maybe the summer. I mean, look, everybody's different. I do find that folks a lot. You're certainly correct that in the global health and public health domains, the students that I generally come across are more adaptable, I'll use that word, than when I was young. But we do still encounter a fair number of students who just sort of get locked into the way to build a career is to stay and build from within. And I have a pretty strong bias that it's really good, like you, it's really good to do different things.
Yeah. No, I mean, I find, I'm just thinking of my last full-time job, where I was responsible for trying to develop and grow staff. As much as it would hurt after a couple of years when they would move on, but I encouraged it. Like, if sometimes I couldn't provide you that growth opportunity that would be next, just because of the nature of working with soft money and what we had available. And I was like, I don't want to get rid of you. You're really good, and we work together well. But if you really want to further your career, you've got to move. And I've pushed people out
Yeah, as have I.
out there. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you believe in as well.
Oh, yeah. I hate to say this because it sounds age biased, but frankly, when I'm interviewing people, I tend to prefer ambitious people, and oftentimes, that doesn't necessarily have to have an age component to it, but being at a university with a large undergraduate campus and individuals coming out of grad school and so on, it's common for us to hire individuals at an earlier point in careers, and then they'll stay 2, 3, 4 years max. I actually think that's a really good. It's a pain in the ass because you got to train new people, but it's actually really good for them, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly right.
So I want to echo Michelle's comments to you guys, which is keep doing that. Do different things, try different things. You do it. Be willing to start in the mailroom when you got to be willing to do that. I agree with Michelle about that too. And if it works, give it a year and a half.
I mean, I think there's also such diversity in terms of what you can do within global health.
Yeah.
I mean, if I just sit and think about the handful of examples, I've designed and implemented research studies. I've done communication programs. I've done new business. I've done startup of, opening a new office in South Africa. I've had to, there's a whole business side to what we do, not just the clinical side. There's, quality of care. There's so many, you need economists, you need epidemiologists, you need analysts, you need data visualizers, you need communicators, you need, it's such a broad field, just even within what we do, that you can move around in that area, as well. I just quickly saw the chat. I know we're against time. I'm comfortable, whatever you all want. And I'm happy to share my contact information. I guess let me type that into the chat. But if people need to go, I don't want to hold anybody up. But I'm comfortable. I can stick around. If I can learn how to type. Yeah, learn how to type. That's a good one.
Directly. Yeah. So thanks, Michelle. Are there other questions, guys? If not. Yeah, good. Okay. All right, Michelle, thanks very much.
Hey, you're very welcome. Good luck, everybody. And feel free, there's, I can help link you up to lots of different organizations. So I'd be happy to help out.
Great.
I
Thanks.
wouldn't have said that if there were 50.
Michelle. Thank you.
All right, go well. Go well. Take care.
Thank you so much.
That.